So I'm a clinician. I'm actually a medical oncologist. In other words, I treat patients with breast cancer with drug therapy. But I have an academic interest in developing new treatments for breast cancer and also understanding how better we might select patients with breast cancer for treatments that we are already using in the clinic. So the title is Studying the Effects of Obesity on Nutrient Use in Breast Cancer. In other words, we know that breast cancers that develop in obese or overweight patients behave differently. So to start with, obese patients are more likely to develop breast cancer, but they are also seem to be more resistant to current treatments. So we want to understand whether it is the availability of nutrients in this patient population that alters the behaviour of breast cancer. We recently published a study looking at a drug called metformin in patients with breast cancer. Metformin is a treatment that is very routinely prescribed for type 2 diabetes, which is a disease that typically arises in patients that are overweight. And many of the techniques that were used in that study, including genetic profiling and profiling of the metabolites or nutrients in the breast cancer samples that we took from these patients, are going to be used in our upcoming study in obesity. So we know that, at least in the laboratory, metformin targets a large protein called complex 1, which is a key component of the energy producing system in mitochondria. Our study of metformin showed that although the doses required in the laboratory are often 100 to 1,000 times greater than those in patients, we saw in our patient samples many of the same effects were occurring at standard clinical doses. So the main focus in our current project is to look at patients with estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, which is the most common type of breast cancer. We know that that more commonly arises in patients who are overweight, and we also know that many commonly used types of treatments for these patients, such as aromatase inhibitors, seem to work less well in overweight patients with estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. Modern gene sequencing techniques can detect whether genes are overexpressed or underexpressed in breast cancer samples. In other words, are they more or less active in a sense? And by looking at patterns in terms of which genes are more or less active, we can get a lot of information about how that cancer may be behaving differently. For example, in response to a drug treatment, or perhaps if you're comparing samples taken from patients that are of normal weight or are overweight. With modern scientific complex projects, one needs to draw on lots of areas of different expertise. So for example, with regards to our genetic profiling of breast cancer samples, we generate huge data sets that we then need help with from bioinformaticians, otherwise known as computational biologists, in order to crunch this data and make it understandable in terms of looking at the patterns of genes that may be over or under expressed in those samples. Ultimately, we want to improve outcomes for patients. And our aim in this study is firstly to try and select patients better for current treatments, and secondarily to try and develop novel drug targets in order to improve therapeutics, particularly in patients who are overweight and have developed breast cancer and we know are often resistant to current treatments. Charitable funding is the backbone of UK medical research, and having developed a close relationship with Against Breast Cancer, I've become acutely aware of the incredible lengths that volunteers go to in order to raise funds for this important work. And it makes me all the more focused in terms of trying to deliver research that is actually going to ultimately benefit patients. So firstly, one can go to the Against Breast Cancer website, which details all the projects that they are funding. Also, with regards to my own projects and publications, one can go to the University of Oxford Department of Oncology website, which has links to a number of my publications.